The focus of this presentation is really about the issue of slavery and how it kind of started to tear apart our country. So since the Missouri Compromise was written in 1820, there were 8 new states that had been added to the United States of America, and 4 of them were new slave states, and 4 of them were new non-slave states, and that kept it even, that kept that number even. So in Senate, you had 15 states worth of representatives that were pro-slavery, and 15 states worth that were anti-slavery, or at least from the north. And so the big problem was that now all of a sudden, because of winning the Mexican-American War and all that new land we got, we had tons of land that were going to become states eventually, and it kind of started to threaten to destroy this balance that we had, because in this new land, since it wasn't around when the Missouri Compromise was written, since it wasn't part of the United States, the Missouri Compromise really didn't apply to it. So really, technically, all of this new land from the Mexican-American War could have been slave states or non-slave states. It didn't really matter. And so the Northerners really started to fear that it would all become slave states and the whole country would become all about slavery. So, with the North being afraid that they're going to lose all of this land in this fight, one man from the North, a senator or representative, I'm sorry, out of Pennsylvania, Dan Wilmot, put together the Wilmot Proviso. And what he said is we should ban slavery completely, not allow them to be slave states in all the new land that we got from the Mexican-American War, every single bit of it. And it actually passed through the House of Representatives in 1846, because there was a higher population in the North, so there were more representatives from the North than there were from the South. However, in Senate, there were the same amount from the North as there were from the South, and so the they were not able to get a majority, and so the Wilmot Proviso did not go through. But it was a big deal because in the South, people were really, really worried about it, even though it never happened, because they thought, uh-oh, the North is trying to attack slavery. They want to get rid of slavery. And the way that we live, our entire way of life, depends on slavery. We need it to continue to live the way we are. And so because it was such a big issue, both the Democrats and the Whigs would not pick a side when it came to slavery. They didn't want anybody to be mad at them. They needed votes from pro-slave states and anti-slave states. And so they really couldn't pick a side and make anybody mad. And with an election coming up in 1848, it was even more important to them. And so there was a Democratic senator named Lewis Cass, who again, out of Michigan, was trying to make absolutely everybody happy. And so he thought the only way that we should make these decisions about slavery and non-slavery is popular sovereignty. We should let the people in each state decide if they want to have slavery or not have slavery. So if the people in these new territories want to have slavery, let them have slavery. Okay? And so this idea that came from the Constitution of we need to put the power in the hands of the people. And so, with this political issue where no one would take a side, some people got really frustrated with it. And so, the people that were against slavery and wanted to take a stand, that were Democrats and Whigs, they decided to split off and create a brand new party where they could officially oppose slavery. And so they created the party called the Free Soil Party. And the Free Soil Party said their main idea was all the land gained in the Mexican-American War should be free soil. So slavery should be completely banned from those places. And so they chose Martin Van Buren as their candidate. Remember this guy who was the 8th president, who was kind of left in a bad situation by Andrew Jackson, and the Panic of 1837 happened, and he just looked kind of bad, even though he really didn't do much that was bad. Okay, but he used to be a Democrat, but he had joined on as a free soiler as well. And so he ran for president, but he did lose to a Whig man named Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor was a Whig, and if you remember, he was that guy in the Mexican-American War who had been sent down to the border and also attacked in Mexico itself, and he eventually wound up being the 12th president. So we knew this would be a battle in these new states that were going to be created in the Mexican-American War, but we didn't really think it was going to happen super fast. And so it kind of got amplified and made really, really fast when gold was discovered in California, and the gold rush happened in 1849. And soon enough, they had enough people, and they had all the wherewithal to become a state. They should have been ready to become a state. And because of the Missouri Compromise, because most of it is above the Missouri Compromise line, it should have been a free state based on the Missouri Compromise. Even though the Missouri Compromise doesn't apply to the new land, it just makes sense, right? If we agreed on that before, we should be able to use that same line all the way across. However, in the South, the people were afraid. They were afraid that if we added in another non-slave state, it would tip the balance of power that we've been talking about so much. And so many of the states said, we will secede from this country if you are going to just go in and allow California to join in as a free state. And so they're basically saying, by saying you're going to secede, that means you're going to break off from the country. You're going to withdraw. You're going to become your own country and break all of your ties with the United States. And so it wasn't a small threat. They were saying, we are going to completely stop being part of America if you do this. And so this fight raged on for months and months, and the North and the South were fighting against each other. And the North wanted California to join in and become a free state. And the North also, because of the reputation of the USA, wanted our capital city, the Washington, D.C., to not have slave trade in it anymore. And so those were the two big things that the North wanted, and the South wanted, California to not be in as a free state, but they also wanted their fugitive slaves, the runaway slaves, to be returned. These slaves that had run away from their master, they wanted them to be captured and brought back because they saw them as their property. And so for months there was battles over these things, and there was no solution. And so now we have to think, who can we go to for a compromise, something that will work for everybody? And the answer is that great compromiser guy, right? Henry Clay was the guy that came up with the compromise that hopefully will work for them. So, in January of 1850, Henry Clay tried to put together a series of compromises, a series of proposals that he thought would calm down the crisis. And so he came up with a bunch of proposals, and these big debates came up about it. And there was a South Carolina senator, a pro-slave man, John C. Calhoun, who was completely against it. And so he hated it. And so he was writing all these things about it, but he was, turned out to be about 4 weeks from when he would die. He was very sick, and he was too weak to even get out of bed. But he did write up a speech, and he had someone else give it in Congress. And he basically said, there are a bunch of attacks on slave states. We are being attacked constantly. You're trying to get rid of slavery slowly. And so there's only two ways that we can deal with it. We either need a new amendment in the Constitution that says states can do what they want, we can keep our own rights, or we need to secede from the country and become our own country. The South does. Okay, and so that was really kind of the two options that John C. Calhoun saw. And Daniel Webster was on the other side, and he was part of the North. He was a Massachusetts senator. And his thought was, what we really need to do is we need to work together to end this fight. We need to end this sectionalism where it's North versus South, and we need to compromise. We need to agree to these terms that Henry Clay has come up with. So eventually the compromise did pass. Congress ended up passing 5 laws based on what Clay had decided would probably work, he thought. And Zachary Taylor, the president at the time, was against it, but then he died in office. And so the next president, the 13th president of the United States, Millard Fillmore, which you probably have to find him in the back of your notes and make sure you talk about or write him in there. Millard Fillmore, 13th president, signed the compromise, all 5 laws into law. And so this compromise had a plan to make both sides happy. And so for the North, they were going to get what they wanted, the 2 things they wanted. They were going to get California entered into the Union as a free state, and they were going to get no slave trade at all in Washington, D.C. Now, the same law that made it so that no slave trade was in Washington, D.C. also said, though, that the government can't regulate if there's trade or not in the slave states. You can't do that. And so that was kind of a win for the slave states, too. Now, in the South, each new state got to choose. Every single new state would get to choose for themselves if they were slave or free. So as they were requesting to be added into the Union, they would get to choose. And then also there was a tough new fugitive slave law, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, that was added in. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And so this Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is kind of, when we think about it now, an outrageous law. So let's learn kind of what part it was and how people felt about it. So the first thing that it did is it set up special government officials that were allowed to arrest any runaway slave or a person who was just accused of being a runaway slave. So if anybody said that black man or that black woman was a slave, and I know it, then the special government officials, like a special police force, would be able to arrest them and take them back down south. And so when they were arrested and taken, there was no trial required to prove that the person was a slave or the person was this white person's slave. All it took was the slaveholder or any white witness to swear that they were the master's property, and they would be returned as if they were the master's property, whether they were ever really a slave or not. And then the third thing is the northern people also were required to help these government officials find these runaway slaves if they needed the help. So that really frustrated, really made angry the northern people, because not only were people deprived of their freedom and taken away from their families and stuff like that, but a lot of these slaves then decided to, or these former slaves, these runaways, ran away and they went up to Canada instead. And so instead of being a part of the workforce in America, they were part of Canada. And so just a couple of things that happened. One Indiana man was torn from his family because they claimed that he had escaped 19 years earlier. And so that happened. And then in the Northeast, there was another man who was accused of being a slave, and he got sent down, but he was pretty wealthy, and so his friends were able to buy his freedom back. But it's crazy to think that all it took was a white person saying, that's a former slave, and then another white person saying, I swear that is so-and-so's slave, and they would be a slave. And so the Fugitive Slave Act, the whole idea behind it was to make the North, force them to respect the ownership that these Southern people had of the slaves. But all it really did was make the Northern people more angry and more convinced that slavery was evil. The other thing that was also convincing Northern people that slavery was evil was Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it was a fiction, but it was supposed to show how bad slavery can be. And so the main characters are Uncle Tom, who was the slave, and Simon Legree, who was kind of the bad guy owner. All right, and it was a bestseller in the North, and it made people see slavery as a real human problem, not just something that a bunch of politicians were fighting over, but really, truly, people were being treated bad. Now, the South said it was made up, it was propaganda, it wasn't really that bad, but the North said we want to show what this is like. That's what Harriet Beecher Stowe thought. Okay, and so I have a quick excerpt from it that I can read. But remember, Tom is the slave and Simon Legree is the master, and this is the point in the book where Tom actually dies. So what happened is, here's the quote. Tom opened his eyes and looked upon his master. There ain't no more you can do. I forgive you with all my soul," and he fainted entirely away. "I believe my soul he's done for finally," said Legree, stepping forward to look at him. "Yep, he is. Well, his mouth shut up at last. That's one comfort." So you can see this really evil type of a slave owner guy was Simon Legree. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act came up in 1854, and it was really pushed through by Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas was a representative from Illinois, and Illinois was a free state. But what he wanted to do for his own state's power and financial well-being is he wanted to create a railroad and build it west. And he needed Nebraska and Kansas to be states in order for him to push that through that way. And so these two new territories were coming in, and they were going to be Kansas and Nebraska. But according to the Missouri Compromise, they both would have had to been free, because those were those states were around before the Mexican-American War, so they actually did fit under the Missouri Compromise. But if we were adding two new free states, that was going to be a big problem, and Stephen Douglas wouldn't be allowed to do that really easily because of the politicians. And so he said that what we should do in this Kansas-Nebraska Act is we should have slavery be based on a vote. And what he wanted was the South to be on board with this and make it go through fast. And the South was very, very happy, but the North was mad because this Kansas-Nebraska Act, because it passed through, it completely got rid of the Missouri Compromise. It undid the Missouri Compromise. So now the Missouri Compromise was basically thrown in the garbage. And so it passed, and the next president, the 14th president, President Franklin Pierce, signed it. And he said, "I've done it. I've fixed it, guys. Everything's good. The slavery debate is over." His exact quote was, the debate about slavery is forever banished from the halls of Congress, saying they would never have to argue about it again. Boy, how wrong was he. And so Kansas started to set up their state, and they, of course, had to vote on whether they were going to have slavery or not. And so there were right around 3,000 voters total in Kansas. But when they went to vote on whether it was going to be slave or non-slave, 8,000 people voted in the election. How was that possible? 5,000 extra people? It was what ended up happening is people came in from Missouri and voted illegally so that they could be sure that it would become a slave state. So when they came in and did that, all but 3 of the legislators in Kansas supported slavery. They were for slavery. And so the anti-slavery settlers said, "This is unfair. A bunch of people came in and screwed up our election. It's not really what we want." And so they had another election, and basically everybody was anti-slavery that they elected. But the problem was neither side saw the other side's election as legitimate. So now Kansas had 2 governments. Every town had 2 sheriffs. The state had 2 governors. It had 2 representatives in every place. It was a bad situation where, of course, conflict was going to come in. And so both groups thought they were in charge. And so it led to a period called Bleeding Kansas, where there were tons of fights, and literal fights where people were dying because of this confusion about the votes. And so one of them that happened, a pro-slavery sheriff was shot because he tried to arrest some anti-slavery guys. And he ended up having to leave because he got shot, and by the time he had fixed himself up and was ready to go again, he came back with 800 men and attacked the town. And so just this crazy Wild West type of a feeling about this place, just because nobody knew who was really in charge. Okay, and then there was another man named John Brown, and he's going to be a big name that we're going to see later on, so remember him. But the first thing that he did historically is he went to Pottawatomie Creek, a settlement right by this creek, this river, and him and 6 other men went there and attacked a pro-slavery settlement and killed 5 pro-slavery men and boys. Okay, and so what was happening is each side was totally terrorizing each other and making it really, really hard to live. But the battle wasn't just happening in the streets and in the towns. It was also happening in Senate. There was a long time um, senator named Charles Sumner, and he gave his speech, a big, rousing speech, really impassioned speech, where he talked about the horrors of slavery and how bad slavery was and how Kansas was a perfect example of it. And he talked bad about another senator named Andrew Butler. And one of the men that happened to be there, another senator, was Preston Brooks. And Preston Brooks was Andrew Butler's nephew. And he did not like the nasty things that Sumner was saying about his uncle. And so he came in with a heavy cane, and in the middle of Charles Sumner's speech, started to hit him. And he beat him until he was bloody and unconscious, laying on the ground in Congress. So the place where they're supposed to get along and have civil conversations and talk like politicians. He went in there, beat him until he was laying on the ground unconscious and bloody. And honestly, Charles Sumner never fully recovered from the injuries that he got that day. Now, the North said, well, look at this. This guy came in and just beat us when all we were doing was giving a speech. And so the South is brutal and they're inhuman and they don't treat people right. The Southerners said, well, he was saying nasty things and Charles Sumner got what he deserved. And so they actually thought it was kind of funny. He ended up getting hundreds, Brooks got hundreds of canes sent to him as a sign of support from the Southern people.